Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for inviting me here and for the very warm welcome that I have received. I want to talk about the Jamaican experience with the IMF over the last 6 years, and in particular, the experience of EPOC, our Economic Program Oversight Committee, in that period of time. I think you will find that there are many similarities with your experience so far, but also a couple of differences. And so take from what I say whatever you think is relevant to Barbados. And at the end, I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. So in 2013, May, when we finally got the nod for an IMF agreement in Jamaica, we had a debt to GDP of 145%. I believe only Lebanon and Japan had a bigger debt to GDP ratio than us. We had an NIR of a couple of weeks, less than $1 billion, and we were totally locked out of every capital market in global capital market. Couldn't borrow any money. It took almost 13 months to negotiate that deal with the IMF. And that is because Jamaica has a long history of relationship with the IMF, most of which is not good. Many agreements have been made, walked away from, failed, discontinued. And so when Jamaica approached the IMF with the kind of data that I just told you, debt to GDP and so forth, they were very skeptical about our commitment to carry through a program. And indeed, they were just as skeptical about a country being able to pull themselves out of 145% debt to GDP without a massive debt haircut. And that is one of the no-nos that the Jamaican government negotiated, same way you have negotiated a no devaluation. Ours was, amongst other things, no haircut. Of course, we had to restructure the debt, but it was NPV neutral. So we had to do a massive tax package to lift ourselves to 7.5% primary surplus. Recall Greece rioted about the same time for 3% primary surplus, and we were asked to do 7.5%. We did another debt exchange, second in 3 years, and we had a wage freeze and a devaluation of approximately 20%. All of this prior to the IMF agreement. So Jamaicans greeted the IMF agreement with a lot of trepidation, a lot of stress, and I think the whole agreement was shrouded in no confidence. I don't think we can do this. It's too daunting. Well, fast forward to today. 6 years later, our debt to GDP is 100%. Our NIR is $3 billion. And we have never failed an IMF test. We passed every single one of them in the 6 years. And Jamaica is slated to leave the IMF in March, I believe, of this year, March or May of this year. The program runs out and we won't be renewing it. So it's like you're coming out of the hospital. Certainly you're out of intensive care. You are at 100% debt to GDP. You're still quite ill, but you're not on a respiratory machine. So I asked myself the question, what made this pretty remarkable turnaround possible? From not being able to access the capital markets to being almost a poster child for the IMF. I mean, after 2 years of the IMF program, the IMF started to hold up Jamaica as a paragon of good that the IMF program can give to nations. And so how is that possible? I think firstly, necessary condition, but not a sufficient one, was that we had no wiggle room, no alternatives. And you know that politicians are like water. If there's a little wiggle room, if there's a little crack, they're going to find it. In our case, there was none. We couldn't raise money, and we were running out of our NIR. So we had no wiggle room, and what we developed between ourselves and the IMF, and I want to stress, the Jamaican technicians played a big role in devising the IMF program. We had a very meticulous, crafted program with milestones that led all the way to what is considered to be Mecca, and Mecca is 60% debt to GDP. I believe that is your target ultimately also. So a great plan, tight stretch, but doable. Secondly, had a strong Minister of Finance, a good advocate. And I think every challenging program needs that. A good advocate, somebody who is going to stand behind it, who is going to win over the rest of the cabinet, and who is going to keep them strong in support of the program. And I think that is the role that Peter Phillips played in those early years. So leadership and advocacy is very important. Thirdly, we organized the private sector and funded a coordinating unit that reached across all of the government to make sure that everybody played their part in passing all of the IMF targets. So in the IMF plan, if you have taken the time to look at yours, I'm sure, similar to ours, it had dozens of things that needed to be done. And they all kind of folded up into a couple big targets that you must hit. But if you don't achieve the small things, you don't hit the big targets. And so this coordinating unit was vital in making sure that far-flung parts of government that weren't as close to the center of activity, the Ministry of Finance, were nonetheless performing and producing what they needed to do to meet the targets. I believe you have maybe not a unit like that, but a person that does that coordination role, vital. I would say, to be honest, we had some good luck too. You remember fuel prices, which were nearly $100 or so in 2012, came back down a lot, and it came down to almost $40. And that gave us a tremendous break on our energy costs. $700 million a year at one point we were saving on fuel. And that helped considerably with our balance of payments and to take some of the pressure off of the cost of living, because energy is such a big part of the cost of living. And then finally, or I should say also, I must give Venezuela a little credit too. We did a debt exchange with them, Petrocaribe. We were able to redeem a lot of debt with them for 50 cents on the dollar. And that made us able to reduce our debt equity, so our debt to GDP ratio very significantly. And then finally, I think the emergence of EPOC as a credible source of truth. That's how I would term it. It was a credible source of truth, and that had a significant impact eventually on patience and confidence in the community, in the private sector, but generally amongst people also. So again, I think that the leadership role that was played, not just by the minister, but EPOC in providing that transparency was crucial for the success. So let me speak a little bit about EPOC in Jamaica, what was its genesis and how it was constructed, and you can see how similar it is to yours. EPOC was really formed because of determination by the stakeholders that they were absolutely tired of this failure after failure. Since independence, we have had periods, maybe a 20-year period of 1% growth per annum. That was maximum. And so we were tired of saying we're going to do things, not achieving it, making agreements and breaking it. And so we said, listen, the only way that we can guarantee as best we can is to have more transparency, to be able to see what is going on and to comment on it. And that is how EPOC was formed. It's almost like a business that's run into trouble. And the bank says, I want to see more. I don't want to just read the P&L and the balance sheet. I want to put somebody in there to handle the cash and to see what is happening. EPOC, in a way, was similar. We wanted to see the data ourselves. We wanted to question the government officials ourselves, and we most of all wanted to express an opinion that was independent of the government. And so it was formed around a core of the financial institutions that took the brunt of the debt exchange. And so there are 4 institutions, and Sagicor was one of them, that took the brunt of that exchange, and they formed the core. Added to that were trade unions, because there was a wage freeze in the civil service. The agricultural sector was given a representative. The private sector, PSOJ, Chamber of Commerce, that kind of enterprise in the private sector were also there. The Bank of Jamaica governor was a co-chair along with myself, and the financial secretary sat at that EPOC committee also. They were all members. We signed an MOU with the government, which essentially gave us no legal power, but gave us authority to see data, to question persons in government, and to express our opinion freely. We met monthly, every month, without fail. As the data came out, we met, had the financial secretary, the governor of the Bank of Jamaica there, called in whoever else we needed, looked at the data, discussed it, and formed our opinion, which we then published every month in 2 newspapers, 41 of them when I was a co-chair. I believe they continue to be done, maybe not as regularly as every month. And in addition, we had press conferences, because we found that in Jamaica, we don't have a reading public. But if you have a press conference and TV cameras are there and the radio is there, people will listen and people will look and people will become energized. And what we found too is it allowed for questions and answers between EPOC and the journalists. And what that produced was a series of exposures for weeks after the press conference. So what we found is that for weeks and weeks, IMF and the program and the achievements and what we were struggling with, all of those items and issues were being discussed in the mass media. We, of course, also had the right and indeed met with the IMF team. No government person there, not even the governor of the bank, nor the financial secretary. Just the non-government people met with the IMF team and questioned them and asked them about the progress, so that we had a truly, as best we could, objective view of what was really happening. The manner in which we reported was important too. We tried to, as best as possible, in the beginning, stick to just the facts. So we developed a format. It evolved after a period of attempts to have data and then explanation about that data with very little opinion. Just let me give you the facts. Here is the target. Here is what we have done. Here is a reason why they did or did not meet that target. No more opinion. Of course, we also brought in data that was not necessarily at the heart of the IMF targets, but was relevant for the general health of the economy. So data like inflation and interest rates and so forth, we also brought into the, so that people reading it would get a rounded view of what was generally happening in the economy. After a while, we found that the performance was really on target and was meeting all of the objectives. And the question arose, could we begin to express an opinion? And I would say maybe 18 months into the program, we had a meeting and we said, let's find a way to express an opinion. And we came up with this phrase, cautious optimism. And that's what we used. The first opinion that we expressed was we were cautiously optimistic about the management of the program by the government. And eventually that evolved into being a little bit more positive than that. But I say that because there are times when you have to be more positive. You have to try to engender and encourage more optimism and participation. So what did EPOC achieve? I think we can say that EPOC created the transparency between government, the private sector, and people in general. We had face-to-face meetings with the private sector, and you would find that the general public who watch TV, they too became very embroiled and interested in what was happening in the IMF agreement. I think also EPOC managed to interpret a lot of what the normal person would call economic jargon. Right? So when you speak about the NIR, the primary balance, the fiscal surplus, things like that, the trade balance, the current account balance, EPOC tried to break it down and make it understandable to the ordinary Jamaican, because it was important for them to know what role that played in achieving our targets. So I think that is another tick that could go beside the achievements of EPOC. There were a couple instances too, I would say, where we pointed out shortfalls in what was happening. It may have been in a particular tax that was lagging badly. It may have been with doing capital expenditure projects. Whatever it is, sometimes we had differences of opinion on the issue of security, crime and security in the country, and how much focus the government was giving to it. But nonetheless, we expressed those views. Sometimes I got a call from the minister. I remember once I got a call from the Minister of Finance, quite upset about a comment that I made about crime and the commitment to dealing with crime. And I just said, Minister, let us agree to disagree. I feel that much more could be done on that, and we left it that way. So be bold, be strong in expressing your views. I think also that EPOC allowed a sense of patience to develop amongst the public. So by seeing that the targets were being met, and by hearing from people who had no special political bias that these targets were being met, that some were more challenging, people developed a patience and said, okay, let me try and give this this IMF agreement a chance. And I would say that for the first 2.5 years, the patience of the Jamaican people was quite enormous. So let me just close off with a couple of remarks on the risks that we experience and that I still see ahead of us, and maybe you too might experience. In the beginning, disbelief in the program. So we have this program that has been wrestled from the IMF, and I think Warren is probably somebody in the audience who knows is closer to the truth than many. It was literally wrestled out of the IMF. All sorts of leverage used. Who had Jamaican parentage and was in Congress in the United States calling up Lagarde, and finally. And then to be confronted with disbelief by the Jamaican public and the private sector in Jamaica that this thing could work. That was one big challenge. And the only way to deal with that risk was to perform. Perform and express that performance. Talk about it, show it. I think also there's a risk of fatigue from too much of this reform and not seeing something, or I should say more correctly, feeling something tangible and positive happening. So after 2.5 years of hearing, yes, we're hitting these targets, people started to say, but I'm not feeling it. Where is the growth? And we had some growth, but it was so small, nobody could feel it. Nobody could say, yes, that factory opened, or yes, that hotel is being built, or yes, my cousin got a job somewhere. And a bit of fatigue, reform fatigue. Because remember, there's tax reform, wage freeze, cost of living going up high, devaluation, pounding on people. And unless you have something practical to show for success, I think you run a big risk. And if there's one criticism looking back on our experience, I would say that in that first IMF program, the government should have been able to change gears a little bit sooner and focus more attention on the matter of growth. And that is what the opposition party saw and took as a winning campaign in that period. So that is a risk that I see us facing. Thirdly, and perhaps this is a risk that we in Jamaica face the most, it's what I call letting go. It's, hey mom, look, no hands, I can ride this bicycle. I think now that we're at 100%, we feel that we are at the tape, but we're really only 60 yards from the starting block. But some of us want to breast the tape and say the race is done. It's not done. You have to get to that 60%, and it's a risk, I think, that we run. Fortunately for us, again, I think we have a pretty tough and good Minister of Finance, and I don't think he's going to let that happen to us here in Jamaica. Let me close by drawing out, if I were to do just two lessons from that whole experience. One is strong leadership. Whether it's in government or it's in the private sector, civil society, got to have that. When you have a big challenge, strong leadership is crucial. And secondly, transparency. The more people know what is happening, whether it is good, great, or bad, is the more committed they are. And I would therefore encourage whatever you do here in Barbados, that use those two trusted and guided principles. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.